All right, hello. Thank you very much for attending today's webinar. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be online for Team Florida members. So for those attending, we will be using the Q&A feature in Zoom to pose any questions to those panelists. So please open that Q&A, type in your question. You can do that either anonymously or identify yourself so that the panelists read those questions and be able to respond. Finally, Team Florida will be issuing continuing education credits for members who registered and attended today's webinar for both engineers as well as our AICP planners. Okay, with that being said, I'd like to introduce everybody to our presenters today. Today we have Steve. Steve holds many degrees, including a PhD, and is a licensed professional engineer in 4 states. He advises clients on their strategies and building their competitive advantages. Something you may not know about Steve is one of his creative outlets. He writes poetry. His first collection of poems will be published within the next 2 weeks on Amazon. Steve, you got to make sure you plug your book in this. That'll be interesting. Also, with us we have Mike. Mike has over 30 years strategizing and coaching with over 600 presentations throughout the U.S., Europe, and the Middle East. He has a creative side, having worked for many years as an actor on the daytime television. And then, Mike, I'm going to have to ask you to elaborate on exactly daytime TV show you were on. Hopefully, it wasn't Jerry Springer. All right.
No.
And with that being said, Steve, I'm going to turn it over to you, sir. The floor is yours.
Sounds good, Brady. Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. Brady, before I get started here, if you would pop up our first polling question asking about working in a virtual environment, who prefers it, who doesn't. I think we all find ourselves in the virtual environment, whether we want to or not, and whether that's going to remain or we're going to do some hybrid or go back to the way things were. Of course, that remains to clearly be seen. Also, before I get started, happy fall, everybody. The fall equinox began at 3.5 hours ago, began today. So our summer is over with. Brady gave brief introductions about my colleague Mike and I. You feel free to visit us too on our LinkedIn site profiles, as well as each of us has for our respective businesses, our own website. I've had the pleasure of working with Mike for many years. We worked together at one firm, and now we have our own separate businesses. But I can tell you, he and I are on the phone probably twice a week, sharing and talking about best practices and on strategy, presentation technique. So he's a trusted colleague, and I know you're really going to enjoy the material he's going to be presenting momentarily. The next, I want to talk about the 3 key points that we want to make on our presentation here today. And it really, the best way to summarize it is as follows. Really about developing the strategic message you want to present to your audience or to your customer or client, getting that message clear, succinct, and delivering it with power, and most importantly, preparing, getting ready to deliver that. You'll note that in my next slide, and many of you may have seen this, former President Woodrow Wilson has a very famous quote. I don't know if anybody has seen this, but it's worth reading. If I am to speak 10 minutes, I need a week for preparation. If 15 minutes, 3 days. If half an hour, 2 days. If an hour, I'm ready right now. So this is coming from our president. Let's think about this, and Mike's going to talk about this a little bit later as well. Right now, we're seeing shorter virtual presentations and longer Q&A periods. So to really get that, what the president is really saying here, to get that tight message, deliver something with impact, preparation is the key. And that's one of the key points we'd like you to walk away from or leave this webinar with today. Now, the next slide, I talk about what is the message we want to deliver. And it falls in many categories. You might be competing to win a service or product contract. It might be financial. You're dealing with revenue or cost enhancement. Maybe you're talking to an audience or customer about a business process or a performance improvements in their organization. Maybe it's online training and education, or it might just be something informative to a public sector audience. It's very important that you focus in on the objectives. Here's what I like to tell folks I work with too. I really think you should stick to one key objective. no more than 3. So you're presenting topics or whatever, the call to action that you want from your customers, don't ask for a laundry list of items. Focus in on 1, no more than 3. And also focus on the value proposition. Why should anybody hire you? Why should anybody accept your message? There's a great book on presentations. In fact, it's entitled So What? And I always encourage folks to read it, because you should always ask yourself when you're getting ready to deliver a message virtually or in an in-person interview, what's the so what here? In my next slide, I talk about I want to go over to what you see in the purple there. This, by the way, one of the words that's most, or 2 words I should say, that are used so often that they've almost become threadbare and they've become a cult, is the word innovative and creative. Everybody's innovative and everybody's creative. It's interesting, I went online to look at the word innovation and presentations and proposals and whatnot. There's over 700 million, by the way. Creative, about 175 million. So I always like to tell people, if you are going to talk about something creative to your audience, to a potential client, it better be. In fact, the Harvard Business Review has an interesting article out calling, it says, stop saying you're creative. However, you can be crystal clear. Oh, by the way, I should just comment on this. I've gone on the websites of 25 engineering firms, because that's where my PhD research is. And I tried to find a phrase that said, we are not an innovative firm. And by the way, it won't surprise you. Nobody says we're not innovative. Regardless, in the message you're delivering, talk about your feature. What is it that you're offering to your audience? Most importantly, what are the benefits to them? If they hire you, if they listen to your message, what does it mean to them? And then also demonstrate and show them. Now, how do you stand out in a fairly crowded field? In the next slide, all of you should be probably familiar with this song by the Beatles. It's called All You Need Is Love. And here's a really sort of humbling sentence in here, or part of the song. There's nothing you can do that can't be done. So you're always going to be, especially if you're in a competitive presentation to win a job, let's say, you're always going to be competing against firms that are very, very good and groups that are very, very good. So is it true that there's nothing you can do that can't be done? I don't think so. And let's talk about how we would go about making you stand out. In the next slide, there's a really something that we all hate. It's the infamous SWOT analysis. We've all done it. Here's 2 points I want to make here, and this helps set up the strengths of your presentation and your strategic message that you want to offer. The first is, I always like to tell people, start with your weaknesses. I've worked on a lot of SWOT workshops, and firms and individuals have put all kinds of strengths. When it comes to their weaknesses, they hardly have any. You can rest assured anybody else that might be competing against you, especially say if it's a competitive presentation, they certainly are going to identify weaknesses in your particular group or people or in your firm. Here's a good way I like to look at it too. Everybody that's on this webinar at some point in their life, in their career, has gone for a job interview. And you've been in front of a interviewer or a recruiter, and they'll say, tell me about your strengths. I don't think anybody that's listening to me right now would say, or would say to the interviewer, I'm just kind of average. So and I know you're going to, not average, you'd say, I know you're going to interview 8 to 12 people today. So why don't you just put my name in a hat, put it in the hat, and if you draw me, fine. If you don't, that's fine too. Nobody does that. You always are putting your best foot forward. So once you've done your SWOT analysis, here's a quick screening tool on the next slide that I really like to do or use. And it's a very powerful technique. It's called the VRIO analysis. And really, here's how you use this. You can put it in a table. You can use qualitative or quantitative assessments. But as part of your discovery and getting to know your audience and what you want to ask of them, what is their value proposition? Make sure you know it cold. Take a look at your skills and what you're offering. Is there a rarity to it? Here's what I mean there. Do you have intellectual property, patents, copyright issues, or the 5 best financial people in the country? Next is what's called inimitability. And by that, I simply mean the following. Is it unique to your firm? Would it be hard or difficult for others to replicate you? And far and away, the most important is organization. Can you pull it all together with your people, your processes? One of the examples I like to use here, all of us have seen sports teams where they fired the coach and maybe fired the management, but they'll bring in somebody new but not change the players. And all of a sudden they start to perform better because oftentimes the management of the new management sees how to better apply the resources. So this is a good example of how to pull all this together and get your message, a strategic message, set up and ready to go, and to be packaged and delivered with impact and the call to action that you're expecting from your audience. So in the next slide, I'd like to, Brady, this might be a point for us to stop and see how we're doing on our polling question.
Yes, Steve. So poll question number one, do you prefer a virtual to an in-person presentation? The results came back that 16 people agreed that they preferred virtual over in-person. 45% were neutral, and 39% disagreed and felt they saw more value in in-person.
Okay, well that sounds great. So because I turn it over to my colleague Mike Iannelli. Mike, I think that you got your work cut out for you. You got to tell people that they're going to have to really ramp up their game on virtual presentations. So I'm going to turn it over to you to talk to our folks about how to get that message nice and succinct, packaged, ready to go, rehearsed, and delivered with impact. So it's up to you now.
Thank you, Steve. So we've done our SWOT analysis, we've done our RIO, and we are, throughout that whole thing, we have our strategic objective in mind, and we're deciding what our differentiators are. And all of this is the same as we would do with an in-person presentation. We have not made the leap to a virtual presentation yet. And so in formulating our presentation, at this point, we're deciding whether we're selling, whether it's persuasive, what type of a presentation we're doing. Whether it's a tutorial, whether it's informative, we always have to be mindful of who our audience is, because that's how we're going to formulate and structure our presentation. And ultimately, we want to decide what response do we want. Now, this doesn't change between our in-person presentation or our virtual presentation. Next slide, please. And in keeping with that, our strategy, you've now developed your strategy, you've developed your differentiators. Where it changes in a virtual presentation is going forward and how you are conveying your message to the client in a virtual presentation. But in terms of if you're hard selling the PM, that PM is still in charge. If you're hard selling a concept, if you're hard selling a development to a public audience, if it's a tutorial, you're walking them through it. But in the presentation, the strategy is always threaded throughout, and you are, based on your knowledge of the audience, you are still figuring what the benefits are and trying to articulate those benefits to the audience. Next question, please. Yes, thank you. So we now hear from the client or the customer that they are asking us to do a virtual presentation. So in addition to the questions that we have always asked, we have to ask additional questions. First up is, what technology are we using? There are multiple technologies out there, some of which are easier than others. They're all a little bit different. They're becoming more popular. They're catching on. We need to familiarize ourselves with those technologies. Can our IT people join the call? It's always good to have IT people because this is new, because we've been on Zoom calls, I'm sure, over the last few months in Microsoft Teams, where the images are freezing up, where sometimes the audio continues, there's no video, sometimes the audio stops. So having an IT person at least on call is very important. Some other trends, and I include this in how long the presentation is, because these are, Steve alluded to it a little bit earlier. We're seeing some trends in that the structured portion of the presentation is getting shorter, and the unstructured, the Q&A portion of the presentation, is getting longer. We're seeing structured presentations as short as 15 minutes, and Q&A being as long as 45 minutes to an hour. So their emphasis is changing a bit, and we need to be aware of those changes and how the customer, the audience, is responding to those changes. Number of participants on the call, I include that because it affects bandwidth. And some folks, you're working in your homes or your offices. In some cases, we are not ready for those broad bandwidths. I know that when my son is home and he's gaming downstairs, I have more difficulty with some of the video chats. And you should always test run the technology. We were on with Brady about a half hour earlier. We spoke to him last week just to test out the technology and to see how everything works. Next slide, please. So we're in reference to the polling, whether you prefer it or not prefer it, there are certain advantages to doing a presentation virtually. And we need to acknowledge those presentations. Some of those, those advantages, some of them come with traps, and we need to acknowledge those as well. The first thing is, by its nature, you're sitting in your home or your office. It's less formal. This is certainly easier to do than for some folks than to stand in front of a large audience. I have done hundreds of presentations. I've never been in a presentation where someone didn't approach me and say, I feel so awkward. I'm not sure what to do with my hands. That's eliminated. You can have notes, and that's a blessing and a curse, but you can have notes. You may not, we're on camera now, but if you have done a compelling presentation, whether in words and slides and graphics, your attention is not, the audience's attention might not be on you. It should be on what you're trying to convey. It can be more informative. We were talking a little bit before about innovation. Steve was talking about innovation. One of the points that I wanted to make was that we interpreted about 10 years or so ago, innovation as it would apply to presentations. So we had multiple screens, we had multiple speakers. Innovation at its most basic form is the innovation that we bring to a solution, to a particular project or concept. So it's not necessarily about the format of the presentation, and I think that we got off track a little bit. And I think that this, in the virtual, is getting back to nuts and bolts. It's the way we were always intended to do it in some ways in terms of content. And it's more relaxed. You're seated. I'm sitting in my home office. I'm looking at the screen. Those are all advantages. Next slide, please. But we need to be aware of the traps that are set up for us to fall into. The technology, much as we were using PowerPoint 20, 25 years ago, whatever it was, it's changing every day. People are utilizing it more. We need to become more familiar with it. While you certainly can have notes, you should not use a script. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of the advantages of this is that it can be conversational. That while I'm talking to a laptop, I'm more relaxed. I'm sitting down. I want to talk directly to my audience. If you use a script and you get interrupted, it's difficult to pick that back up. We were all asked to memorize the Gettysburg Address, I guess, in grammar school. And if we lost a word, we would forget what the heck the rest of the Gettysburg Address was. Similar to a script, if you get interrupted, you have to find your place, pick it back up. Not a great way to do it. Also, if you are tracking a graphic and you're working on a script, the graphic, we don't have the benefit now of using our hand or a laser pointer to direct the audience's eye. So we're doing it with the script, and we'll talk a little bit more about creative ways that we need to do that. But if you are reading a script and not following the track of the graphic, you could lose track of that graphic and not be in the right place. Another trap, while you might not always be on camera, you should assume you're always on camera. Somebody might glance up and see you in the corner. You need to always recognize that while you are not being watched at every moment, you are on display. And camaraderie, enthusiasm, passion for the project, the concept, the solution that you're working on, those things still matter. And it's a little bit more difficult to convey through this environment, but it's still important, and we need to choreograph that. We need to work on that to make sure that the client or the audience feels that passion that we have for the job. And the way we do that is we rehearse, and we rehearse so that we're prepared, and that's confidence. Next slide, please. So I think that, did we have a polling question here, Brady?
Yeah, I just pulled the polling question up. It's online now.
Okay. Graphics, are they more important in a virtual presentation, whether you agree, neutral, or disagree? Let me quickly talk about how they're different. We have all done presentations, been involved in presentations where we had a graphic at the front of the room that no one could read. We picked it up, we flashed it. Maybe we had a board, we put the board on a table in front of some folks. We showed something, we're working in a big room, the people in the back of the room couldn't see anything. That doesn't exist. And I see that 75% of the folks here agree, and that's terrific. We are now so much closer to the source of the graphic. I mean, I am literally a foot from my laptop. If a graphic comes up, I can lean in and look very closely. If someone is speaking to it, you need to work with your graphic, with your creative folks, so that your graphics are clean. The content is, certainly you want it to be correct, but you want it to be easily discernible. And you also want to work with colors, animation, movement, something that will direct the audience's eye to the spot on that graphic, on that image, on that overhead that you're using, so that you can get the most out of it. You're verbally walking the audience through the graphic. And you need something that never changes. Whenever we're doing a presentation, whenever we're showing a graphic, you're always, just as we are today, I mean, we could talk about presentations for hours, but we're limited by time in how much information we can put forward. It's the same thing in a presentation that you're giving to a client, and it's always valuable. When you recognize that you have a strength, it's always valuable to plant seeds within the presentation so that the client or the audience looks at those seeds and it prompts a question. And you prompt a question that you can hit a home run with. And that's really what you're seeking to do. Next slide, please. So, as I mentioned, I've done a bunch of these, and when you have an in-person presentation and it's 45 minutes, an hour, I've worked on presentations that were 8 hours with breaks, of course, but you can choreograph movement and slides, and you have two people talking on either side of a screen. You have interaction between people. You have someone pointing to a screen while another person narrates what they're looking at, what you're looking at. Those are different ways that you look to break up a presentation so that you can maintain interest, so that the audience doesn't start to fade. It's obviously very different. You have to utilize what you have at hand. And these are some of the challenges of a virtual presentation, but they're not insurmountable by any means. You use your voice, you use your inflection, it's conversational. Certainly you don't want to read, but you can change things around. If you're using, of course, getting back to graphics, that's a way to maintain interest in what you're doing. When your volume, you need to speak authoritatively. You're seated. Now, the advantage when you're seated is that you are relaxed. The disadvantage is that you have to drum up your energy and really work on getting that energy and get wired up. And it's important that you do that. It's important, passion and excitement, and I can't emphasize this enough. When I first started in the business years ago, we got a letter from a client that said, I wish that all of my consultants had the enthusiasm that you displayed in your presentation. It's important to every customer, client, public that you are excited about what you're presenting, that you are passionate. And I can't emphasize enough, that passion and excitement needs to jump out of the screen, and it needs to jump directly into the laps of your audience. Next slide, please. So this is a major difference. When we've done presentations in the in-person world, and again, we don't know what's going to happen in the virtual world. This may go all back to the way it used to be 6 months from now. It might be that this becomes the way of the future and it doesn't go back. So, but in the past, we would call the client or the agency, and we would say, okay, where are we presenting? And they would say, oh, your room 101. Can we come up and see it? Yeah, sure. And you go and you find that it's a tight, cramped room with lots of bright light or no light at all. It is hot. You can't bring as many people as you need to bring. They dictated to us, the speakers and those making the presentation, the environment that you're speaking in. Well, now we control that environment. So we control perception. And some of those perceptions, now it's fun. I mean, there are some of these softwares that we're using these days. There's a fun aspect to it. You can change the environment that you're presenting in. You're sitting on a beach someplace. You are in the Arctic. You're in on the moon. Yeah, some of that's fun for a little bit, but we need to be careful that we're not glib. We want to avoid bunker-like settings. This is a great opportunity. Controlling the perception is a great opportunity to sell. And if you're in your home office or you're in your office at work and you are the information behind you, the book titles should be relatable. They should be titles that complement the topic that you're talking to. If you have a plant that you haven't watered since the 60s, that's probably not something you want to show and convey to your audience. So my suggestion to you is you clean it up. Now, I'll tell you, I cleaned up the area behind me, not knowing what this audience could see. But when I look forward, what you can't see is all the junk I have on my desk. But that's perfectly fine. You can't see it. So you create that environment that's complementary to your goal. Next slide, please. So I think we have a poll for this as well. Do we not, Brady? There you go. Greatest challenge. And I'll wait a moment, but I'm often asked, what's the most difficult, what's a great presentation? What would you say is a great presentation? Is it the technical side? Is it the person who's in charge? Is it the camaraderie? What's most important in a presentation? What's most important to the client? And the answer to that is all of that is important. What's most important is that you convey that to the client. And I'm seeing that you guys are right along with me, so this is great. What's most important is connecting with the audience. It's if no one likes the group, if no one believes that this group has worked together, if no one understands what it is you're trying to sell or what it is your concept or solution is, you've lost an opportunity, and you could potentially lose that job. We've all been in situations where those things happen. You need to connect. And while connecting in an in-person presentation is something that we have all experienced and we've worked on, and we probably all know how to do that, connecting virtually is very different. The first thing, and I will tell you that you go online and you watch Wall Street Titans and all of these folks making presentations to stockholders, and I'm amazed when I'm looking at some of these folks and they have the camera underneath their chin and a shadow looking like, you know, like a vampire. You see that the camera is above, making them look like they're 2 feet tall and weakening them. It's important that you look directly into the camera. It's important, this is political season, obviously, and we have all seen presentations, people making speeches. The ones that I'm finding to be most effective are the people who are on screen, talking to the camera, and I feel as though they're talking directly to me. That's the same thing that we want to accomplish in a virtual presentation. So look the camera in the eye, talk to the camera. The people are right on the other side of that camera. Next slide, please. So another poll, I think our last polling question, Brady, comes up about now. We probably do these polling questions just before we get to that slide, but. So I will tell you again, going back to trends, and Steve alluded to it, and we have seen it in a number of recent presentations over the last 6 months. As I mentioned, the structured portion seems to be getting shorter, and the unstructured portion seems to be getting longer. Again, there are challenges in doing virtual Q&A, but they are not, again, insurmountable. They are just there are things we need to be aware of. And there you go. Good. Wow. I'm talking to the choir here. It's great. As always, Q&A is always important, and everyone knows that. We have all seen projects, jobs, issues being raised that you didn't want raised in a Q&A that went south. Part of that is they were not rehearsed. There's all kinds of reasons for that. One of the disadvantages of doing a virtual Q&A is we can't see the audience's reactions to some of the things. And we would sometimes tailor our answers when we saw a particular reaction. We see somebody not paying attention, we would tailor our answer to that person. We can't do that. But there are things we can do. We can certainly utilize our graphics again. I would anticipate what graphic elements you are going to use in a Q&A that might come up and have them ready. There's also, for example, very often schedules don't come up in a presentation, but they may come up in the Q&A. So that's a perfect example of a graphic element, excuse me, that we use in an in-person presentation that doesn't have the value that it could have, because if it's too in-depth, people can't see it. And if we clean it up so it's not that in-depth, it becomes meaningless. So in this virtual environment, those graphics take on more weight, they are more helpful, they have more value. So you prepare graphics, you anticipate graphics, and you put them in the basement. And getting back to what we said earlier, this is a less formal environment. It lends itself to a conversation across the table to get the best answer to the client and the audience so that you can work together. So how do you fashion your Q&A team to get the best answers? Next slide, please. We prep. And again, getting back to what we said earlier, you rehearse, 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 rehearse. You should prepare, and this is whether it be an in-person presentation or a virtual presentation, you're preparing questions to pepper the Q&A team. And the answers I like the best are the ones that are prepared by someone who knows about the concept, but is not necessarily a member of the team. And it gives the Q&A panel an opportunity to develop answers on the fly, to work with one another and develop that camaraderie and develop the answering process. it's very important for the people in the room to all know where that expertise is in the room. That's nothing different in a virtual presentation. There are signals in an in-person presentation. We have hand signals, we have, excuse me if I might jump in, we have all kinds of stuff. In a virtual presentation, there are, each of the softwares has either raising a hand or some sort of question, a way of getting the attention of the speaker. Although I will tell you, there may have been questions coming through and I haven't paid any attention to them, I apologize. But there are ways, and we need to become familiar. That's one of the reasons why you're working with the software before you go in to do the presentation. Work with that and understand how the software is used, how you can ask those questions and how you can work together. And work on creating an environment, an across the table environment. That's the key element to getting the best answer out. And again, it isn't in an in-person presentation. I think that it's a little bit more formal. This is a perfect environment to get the best answer out for everybody involved and get the answer that the audience has asked. Next slide, please. So with that, we are now open for questions.
Hey, Mike, I'd like to just comment on one thing as we're getting ready to go and take questions from the attendees. Keep in mind a couple of things about virtual presentations. If you record the presentation, and I'm not talking about the rehearsal, I'm talking about game day. You can also think about, for example, the NFL. They'll always talk about, you know, how teams are viewing films, right, to see how the other side is going to perform, and help as they help to build their game plan. One of the real values of recording is you can also use it as a great training tool for other presentations. Secondly, if you're in a competitive presentation as well, when you go for debriefings, you'll have the exact presentation, of course, that you did. And rather than say, do you remember when you said this, or did you say that, or did I say this? You'll have everything, which will help even in your debriefings as well, either before or after the sit down with the client, for those of you that are doing a competitive presentation. So I just wanted to make those 2 points, as well.
Good point, Steve. I see we've got some questions. Brady, would you just like us to read through them, or?
Yes, if you want to go ahead and just read through those questions and then go ahead and respond, and if there's additional dialogue, they can type back.
Okay. Innovation and creativity seem to be overused words in a presentation. How do you recommend giving them meaning?
You want me, Mike, to tackle that one?
Yeah, and I have something I'd like to tack onto it, but go ahead, please.
Okay, as I mentioned before on that, what I like to see with innovation is what is a game changer. In other words, what really, not just an improvement on a process that exists or an approach that exists, but something that really, really makes a change. Big financial savings, a whole new way of doing something. Otherwise, it's improvement. There's nothing wrong with improvement, obviously. But when I see these words, the first thing that goes through my mind is, what is really innovative about this? Is this a whole new process? Maybe, as I said, somebody's got a patent on something or copyright on some software or whatever it might be. So I like to look at, or I like to consider something that, again, is a game changer. Mike, you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, and I think that one of the things that has happened, that happened to maybe about 10 years or so ago, is people interpreted technology, it's interpreted innovation with what I mentioned earlier, being the big show in a presentation, doing the multiple screens and the music and the multiple speakers, when at the end of the day, the innovation is what you're talking about, Steve. It is saving money, saving time. How do you do this so that the public is happy, safer, whatever it might be? But those are the innovations, and I feel as though a lot of folks tried to have fancier presentations so that they allude to the fact that we're cutting edge. And I think that we got off track a little bit. So I just wanted to kind of reinforce that.
We got
I got the next question. What do you do if you have a total technology failure? What's your backup plan for a virtual presentation? I have my slides printed out in front of me. If you can, and if we were to have a breakdown on the screen, for example, if we, for some reason, lost our video feed, we could still work with my handheld, and I can still deliver the presentation without the slides. Again, it's very important that you know what your point is and that you speak to your point, not necessarily the script. Having said that, if you can reach out to your customers, clients, audience, and say, listen, just as a backup here, it's not like the old days where you went in with the printouts of the slides, but can we send you stuff that you can distribute if amongst your committee or whoever, so that we can walk through that in case there is a technology failure. Steve?
Yeah, one of the points that I would add is when I rehearse with groups, one of the things I like folks to do is not be overly reliant on your PowerPoints either. Here's a real challenge. Take your slides, deliver your presentation, but don't look at your slides at all. Okay, many of you may be familiar with a presentation technique.
Did I lose you, Steve?
Called technical technique too, in case you have a total failure with the technology.
Speaking of which, right in the middle of that, I lost the audio feed for you. So, let's see.
I'm on. I don't. There you go.
Okay. Let's see.
How about Mike? One individual has sent us a comment that oftentimes innovation is a scoring criteria, especially in a competitive presentation to win a job. And my sense on that is too. There's a chance where you can really shine. Your team, your organization, you can show proofs of what you did. But again, to me, you should really show items that go back to that feature benefit proof model and really show how you've saved money, how you've got something done much more quickly, and not just say, well, we did it a little bit better, or because really this is a place where you can really show your advantages.
Yeah. Just have a question here from Alfred. Have you seen any clients that have actually created new criteria or requirements for presentations, like limit the number of slides, no videos, etc.? The thing that jumps out at me is what I've noticed is that more than one client seems to be putting less emphasis on the formatted portion of the presentation. As I mentioned, 15 minutes. So how many slides can you get into 15 minutes? Really not that many. And they are directing you maybe a little bit more on what they want to hear. And in some cases, they're asking you to respond to questions, and you're responding to questions in 20 minutes. And then after that, they're having another 40 minutes of kind of freewheeling, free-for-all Q&A. I haven't seen limits except in the instance of time and also in the instance of handouts. They're limiting the types of handouts that you can give to, and it is limiting just by its nature. You're not in front of a client. So the placemat that we used to use, that have been used so often, where you have the org chart or you have headshots of the team, you don't necessarily need those in some ways because they're right in front of you. But I think that the requirements, while the requirements may not have changed, practicality has changed what those handouts are going to do. Steve, you have any thoughts on that?
No, I think you've covered that. You've covered that one well, Mike. We have one here, Mike. This is one you and I have talked about a lot, about the background noise and uncontrollables. You know, dogs barking, children screaming, thunderstorms,
Yep.
all of life's everyday occurrences. And what happens when we start to when those become issues? Short of maybe going to a sound studio or soundproof studio. What are your thoughts on that too, Mike? I mean, that's obviously one thing you could do. Maybe go to a setting like a university conference center or something where you can really cut down on noise, but you're still likely to deal with those issues.
Yeah, I don't feel comfortable in a public setting because you don't really know what you're going to get. Maybe that's the day that there's a demonstration on the quality of the food in the cafeteria. So I don't know that I think that's a great idea. What I would say is some of those things that are uncontrollable, the client, the customer, the audience is experiencing themselves. It is another way to make you more human. And it is also a way where this becomes less of a Broadway show and more of a conversation between an offer and those receiving the offer. So I would say that it's what makes it a little less formal, and I would run with it. I mean, if there's an interruption, your dog starts barking, you can't ignore the elephant in the room. Sorry about that, folks. My dog just went crazy. The mailman came. It kind of makes you more real. And it's kind of like, you are exposing in the environment and the perception that you set, you are allowing your audience to come into your life. Let them do that. And this is a part of that. And I think that makes it more conversational and makes it more, can be much more informative and much more productive.
Mike, there's a question here too about what is your feeling of the teams virtually presenting in the same room with appropriate social distancing that we're dealing with now, as opposed to being in different locations and potentially different states. It could even be different time zones, of course, as well. I have found it can have advantages and disadvantages. However, I wanted to hear your experience and suggestions. One of the most obvious one to me is just rehearsing. You need to set up that technology. Also, right next to you, at least this is what my recommendation always is, you want IT people, both on the client side or the audience side, as well as on your side, that can step in. And again, Mike said it many times, to rehearse incessantly and get ready. Now, does that mean you're still not going to have problems? No, you may still, and you'll need a fail-safe plan. Mike, do you want to add anything to that one? Or?
Yeah, I mean, when this all first started, everybody was in separate locations. I've noticed it's, as we move forward a little bit, folks were not necessarily in the same room, but they were in the office building. They were in, who's in there doing their piece and they're on the second floor, and who's doing their piece and they're in their office on the fourth floor. So it is closing a bit in some ways. I think that if you can be in the same room, socially distanced at some point in time, I think that works. But you need your own setup. I don't think that what we want to be doing is necessarily having folks stand up, leave the laptop or the so that in that visual, so there is an empty chair there and someone else comes in and sit down. That's a little too much of an interrogation to my mind. So I would just say that, have your own setups. If you're in the same room, it actually presents more issues because if anybody is talking, that's going to be a distraction. So, we're all learning through this. This is all totally new ground. And as we move forward, we're figuring it out. And, in some cases, I think that as we move forward, we're going to see some of that and we'll work with it and we'll work around it. But right now, I think so. I would say, we're working in separate places. We'll go from there and see what happens. I see.
One of the things I'm looking at one of the questions here. I was thinking about putting my client's hat on because I was on the client side for a little over 10 and a half years. in some ways, virtual presentations, if they're recorded, you know, oftentimes what we do is we're trying to organize when is the client going to be available. They'll give you time slots. Maybe somebody's on vacation or whatever. What's really nice about them, if a client will permit this, and I'd like to know if anybody that's on this webinar has experiences, you can record your presentation, upload it, and send it into the client, and they can review it at their leisure. Obviously, making sure it meets the 10 or 20-minute time frame, whatever, and then also organize the Q&A period with you separately. So it gives an interesting dynamic as well for to be on the customer or the client side. And I'd be interested if anybody has had that experience.
Yeah. I'm seeing a question here from you. I'm used to taking visual cues from the audience, clients, and interview committee, which is difficult in virtual meetings. Suggestions. I would tell you that single issue is, in some ways the greatest challenge. For those folks who are working from getting feedback from clients and getting that body language response, that person that seems to be doodling, that you kind of walk closer to them so that they put their pen down. You're communicating with them passively by telling them, hey, pay attention. The fact of the matter is that those are cues that we need to, if you're looking for those cues from their facial expressions, you may get off track. I mean, you're going to have, when you're doing Q&A, you're going to have facial expressions. You're going to have the little boxes, just as we do here, of folks who are listening. That could become a distraction for you because you're kind of hunting around for who you want to look for. I would tell you that I think that we need to begin to think about, from both the client side, and I would ask you about this, Steve, visual cues are some of the ways that clients have responded in certain ways and what they like and they don't like. While we have to respond to that from the presenter side, from those folks that we're presenting to, I would think that they want to convey their likes and dislikes in a different way. And I think that what we need to do is make it as informal as possible so that the person on the audience's side says something like, can you explain that in a little bit more detail? Or I'm not sure that you totally answered my question, because there is no benefit of visual cues. Thoughts, Steve?
I agree with that, Mike. There is an interesting presentation or a question here I'd like to move to. Do you suggest utilizing post-presentation surveys? They seem to garner a light response level. So I'm assuming that this question relates to asking the audience or the clients to respond to what they heard. And I can tell you that here's how I've used them, but it's been in a different setting. I still teach in an MBA program, and my students get to assess me in the course and all of those things. So I use those surveys to help me ask questions up front and to help me build my lectures, if you will. And one of the questions I always ask students right at the very first class is I say, take out a sheet of paper and fill in the following. In order for this class to be relevant to me, we must. Don't put your name on it, just give it to me. Now, oftentimes some will say, well, I need to get an A+, or I need to get an A. So once I throw all those out, I do tend to get some pretty good responses on how to sort of tailor future offerings. So I think they have some value there. Obviously it's after the fact when you get a post presentation survey, but they can also offer you, if you can get good input, preparation points and then a good approach to future presentations. Mike, you got any comments on that one? Or
No, I agree. I think we need to be careful with those, depending on the timing. I think the timing is important when you would put out a post presentation. Certainly it would be after the decision. But I think that, you know, on that other side of the table, some of those folks are reluctant to say necessarily what it was that you have a problem with. So, you know what I mean? They're not necessarily looking to help you. They're looking to get the most information for them.
Right.
So,
Here's one. Does having earpieces or headsets on seem unprofessional in a presentation? You want to take that one, Mike?
I don't think so. I mean, I think that, you know, the technology varies, and we are using different technologies. Some folks can use the audio. I'm using the audio on my laptop, but in some cases that might not be something that they have. I think that you know, until we determine this is the technology we're always going to use, I think that we need to be as comfortable as we can possibly be. I don't think it's unprofessional, though. I don't think it's unprofessional. I saw a question here. During Q&A, besides raising your hand, what other things can be done to chime in a response without interrupting the current speaker? Again, there are some, I'm not sure if you're referring to beyond the technologies. I'm looking, I see that Brady is sending me a note here. So that's one of the things that you can do, is send a little note in the chat and say, you know, when you're done, can you throw it to me? That is also something that gets done during practice and during rehearsal. But with the chat, with the raising of the hands, there are, as you become more familiar with the technologies that you're using, I think you'll find that there are a number of different ways that that you can get a message to the speaker, that you can do that. And at the end of the day, there is nothing wrong with saying, for example, as I said to Steve, if I could just add, boom, and you've got your, and you make your comment. And I think it's the same thing in Q&A that we would say in an in-person presentation. If one person gives an answer and one person wants to get in and it becomes a conversation, that's fine. If 4 and 5 and 6 people start diving in to basically, not as a participatory thing, but almost kind of tacking on more to the answer, which is a little bit different, then I would say that weakens the person who originally answered the question. Usually if it's the PM or whatever, whoever we're working with, that weakens them, and it seems as though they didn't hit the answer, and that's not what you want to do. So let's just take a look and see what Brady has put here. Have you had meetings where the client keeps their cameras on to help all their, to tell all their reactions? Most of them want to keep their cameras off. Yeah, I've seen most of them off, but I have seen a few that have been on. And I think it's catch as catch can. That might be one of the questions that you want to ask. Will we be muting? Will we be shutting down the cameras and only leaving the speakers on so they can speak? Sometimes that becomes a bandwidth issue too. When you close the video, you release bandwidth, and some of the freezing that goes on, if there's 25 people on a call, you can stop that freezing up by some of the folks closing out their video.
Mike, here's one. How do you stop folks from talking over one another?
To me, that's practice. That's no different than in an in-person presentation. You wouldn't, in an in-person presentation, you wouldn't step on someone else's talk, and you would need to work on all of that stuff within the technology. I have something I'd like to add. If for some reason that person doesn't respond, you can, if I might, but we all need to, you know, I find this around the dinner table, that we all need to be patient and wait our turn to talk. It's not, you know, we don't have racing stripes on our tongues. So We need to be respectful. We need to be mindful of the fact that we are empowering the people who are talking. And anything like stepping on people or talking over them, that's going to weaken them, and we don't want to ever do that.
One of the notifications, Mike, that you and I talked about, and whether it's raising hands or sending a chat or whatever, we just received from Brady. So our time is essentially up here. I guess I would say to the audience on this webinar, thanks so much for being with us. You can, like I said at the start of our presentation, if you need more information from Mike or myself, check us out on LinkedIn or on our websites, and as importantly, get involved with Team Florida. It's a great organization. I've had some, involvement with them, and it's a great networking place and for knowledge and, just keeping you current on the latest and greatest in transportation issues in Florida. So there's my plug for Team Florida. And like I say, stay involved, and get others to get involved with you as well. Yeah, and I'd just like to say thank you. I hope we answered all your questions. Again, in the interest of time, we couldn't get into really great detail. If there's something, bang us out an email. Certainly we'll respond to any of that stuff. And if you'd like to talk, we're certainly available to do that. But I want to thank you all for your attention. I want to thank you for your participation. Brady, thank you very much for inviting us. This was great. Really
I have one quick question real fast. Sure. First, thank you guys very much for your time. But there was a very important question that was missed, and it was one of the first questions that were asked, which was the name of the book that Steve is publishing. And Mike, I mean, you're on TV. What are we talking here? General Hospital? What is it?
No, I was on TV. And because I was on Channel 7 soap operas, and because I was always the bartender or the cameraman, or I had 2 lines. After a while, I said, yeah, I'm not going to be a movie star. So, and Brady, the poem book is called Exploring Life, One Poem at a Time. I write a lot about nature, spirituality, family, have a lot of fun. I got a watercolor artist to do illustrations for each one. So, I know poetry is not on the New York Times bestseller, but it's been a fun project. I'm working on my second one, and I am actually working on a business strategy book. So thank you for asking.